Hello. In one of my last videos, I spoke about the CIS form, that is a form that is mandatory in New Jersey to be given to the clients in the first meeting in person. I like to use this format. It's a trifold 8.5 by 11, very easy to carry in my car all the time to give to the clients. There's a space for the client to sign, and it's a very practical form to present to the client to comply with the law. This form talks about all of the agency laws that we practice in New Jersey. It was changed last year with an update because of a new form that is now also practiced in New Jersey called the designated agency, that it becomes very good to avoid the dual agency situation. And I'm going to start today with this video talking mainly, pretty much about only the buyer agency agreement, because that buyer agent and buyer agency agreement are attached together. And that's also a form that is now mandatory in New Jersey since August of last year. And this form is basically an enforceable contract that we are obligated to have signed by any buyer that wants to see a property with us before we show it. Now, what would be the best procedure to work with a client that wants a buyer agent representation? And is that the best way for a buyer? I would say yes. The best way for a buyer really is to have one agent that is going to have a fiduciary duty with that buyer to work for that buyer. And for that, I'm going to show you a little more in detail the CIS form and the buyer agency agreement. The CIS form, when open, it's pretty much like this. It's what I have in my hands, but now open. And it really looks like this on one side with the space for signatures, and it would look like this on the other side, explaining the other forms of agency that are on this side of the page, with seller agent, buyer agent, disclosed dual agency, and of course, on the other side of the page, it would be the uh, the designated agency. So this form is the form that is mandatory in the first meeting, and that first meeting is not mandatory. The exclusive agency agreement that should be signed, exclusive buyer agency agreement that should be signed before a showing. This would be the form also, the exclusive buyer agency agreement, that is in our company a two-page document, very simple, very easy to read, compare with other forms that you find out there that other companies are using, that is like a 5 or 6 page, much more difficult to understand. And this is a very concise and easy to understand form with the choice for the buyer that can choose that they don't want to see any properties that the seller is not paying buyer agent commission. If that's the case, so when the agent calls to show a property, we have now to call the listing agent to find out about buyer agent commission. If they say no and you have choose not to see those properties, if you are extremely interested in that property, another conversation should happen. Let's now talk about those conversations and the obligations of the buyer agent, and also the fiduciary duty that that agent has with the buyer. So, first anything, how would I start a situation with a buyer agent? is really with a meeting that sometimes it happens in a phone call, and then the best thing to do would be an in-person meeting where we explain these things and have the client signing the buyer agency agreement if the client is okay to do that right there, but at least the CIS form, so we have proof that in that first meeting with the client we gave one and we kept a copy signed. The Once the client signs a buyer agency agreement, or if agreed that we're going to work together, we can sign that form previous to the first showing. I recommend that that form should be signed as soon as we start to work together, because the agent is going to start to put time. If it is a good agent committed to help that buyer, is going to start to put time searching for the properties that the buyer told him that he was interested in looking at. The uh, property with so many bedrooms, so many bathrooms, um, new construction or not new construction, properties that are only split levels, or that is only a colonial, central colonial, whatever style that buyer is interested in, and the town's price point, all of those things put together in the notes of the agent. The agent is going to prepare searches and look for the properties and start to email the client with those properties that the client can see the pictures, and and then they can schedule showing appointments and go look at the properties. Now, before any showing, that buyer agency agreement, it must be signed, because that's the law in New Jersey. Now, let's say now we're already looking at the properties, and the agent is going to take the client into a property. They're looking at everything. They look at two properties, three properties, whatever. The agents are also going into the broker open house to preview the properties, and maybe calling a client from right there. Here, we need to show this property ASAP. We need to come and look at this property. It's a very attractive property. The market is hot. So these things happen because inventory is low and the properties are selling very fast. The Once they agree on a property, then the agent is going to prepare an offer. I would recommend that a good conversation, and that these days can be done over Zoom, and explaining the New Jersey sales contracts to the client. In one of my next videos, after I explain everything about the agency situations, I will go over a New Jersey real estate sales contract that is very simple. It's a very bilateral. It's not really a big deal. It's, people from other states make a big deal out of it because they're not used to that. Like New York, for example, the attorneys are the only ones doing real estate contracts. We are not doing the contracts. The contracts are done and prepared for us by the National Association of Realtors, or actually in New Jersey, the New Jersey Association of Realtors prepares those contracts with blanks. They're legal, and if not taken to an attorney, once they are fully executed, the clients have 3 days to take to an attorney for full attorney review. There's two different situations in New Jersey. We'll talk more about that. Let's just concentrate on the representation of the what the agent is doing in buyer agency agreement. So uh, once they choose the property, it is always a good thing that if the client is not yet familiar with the prices, because it happens sometimes. The client fall in love with a property that they saw the second showing, and they're not yet familiar with the way the market is behaving, and the difference many times about the price that is normally selling the property selling for 10% above asking price, 5%. And we have tools within the MLSs. The most used MLS in Essex County, Union County, and Morris County. In those three counties, mainly the MLS that is most used, and even Somerset County, is the Garden State MLS. It's a very good MLS with a lot of tools for the agents to be able to analyze the movements of the market, the differences that exist in different price points, how the properties, depending on days on the market, how they are selling above asking price or not. So that's part of the work that a good buyer agent should do, is inform properly the buyer, so the buyer can put an offer very well informed and can make a very well informed decision of what kind of offer is going to do. I missed to say something before we get to this point. The buyer must have been pre approved. Actually, I make sure that my buyers are pre approved before I go show properties to those buyers, because otherwise, we don't really know what we're doing if we're showing properties to a buyer that he can afford or not. So that has very little to do with the buyer agent, but it's very important. It's a very important step to be done before we get to actually show the properties and fill up an offer. So we're filling up an offer, we're explaining everything about those offers that are about 14 pages because there's a lot of details. Nothing complicated, but there's a lot of details. We'll get to that later. We're filling up the offer, and the offer is going to be presented to the listing agent. Unfortunately, these days is the way things are because of the way the market was a few years ago with so many offers. Um, Things changed. I'm from the time where we used to present the offers in person to the seller, and when there were multiple offers, we were maybe sitting in our cars waiting for the listing agent to call us inside of the house one at a time to present the offers to the seller in the dining room table, in the kitchen table, whatever. That seller and the listing agent prefer to have that presentation done. Nowadays, we are sending the offers to the listing agent. 99% of the situations, that's the way it happens. If you want my opinion, I think that's not the best way, because it is not the best way to do the fiduciary duty with that buyer. But we have to act in accordance with what that seller uh, asked to the listing agent. Most of the times is the listing agent that influence that situation with the seller, but that's the way things are right now. So the buyer agent is going to email the listing agent with the offer, with the pre-approval, with some other information that sometimes is requested. Sometimes the buyers want to write a letter. Uh, it's something that most sellers will not read if they have a good listing agent. The sellers should not read those letters. Um, I don't recommend my buyers to write any letters, because those things can only end up in a true promise. But the important information, financial and a good offer, very well put together, is the important thing. So in many situations, and I would say probably 90% of the situations these days, we still see multiple offers. And that listing agent most likely is going to come back to us with asking for highest and best, and we have to sit down and go again with a good informed decision to present that offer. Let's move on and think that your offer was accepted. Now the listing agent has sent to the buyer agent a fully executed contract. So now the seller signed your offer and we have a fully executed contract. And Real Estate Commission New Jersey says time is of the essence. We need to get that offer ASAP to the hands of the buyer for the buyer to give to a buyer's attorney if he wants to have an attorney representing. Um, from I'd say Woodbridge up north, everybody uses attorneys, is the New York influence. Everybody uses attorneys to do attorney review on these contracts. Now, I have done transactions with people that comes from the West Coast. They don't want to use attorneys. And then if no attorneys are used, 3 days after the signatures are in the contract, the contract is binding, is a firm binding contract, and people has to proceed with that transaction. Deposit monies are important to be in place within the dates and is part of the responsibility of that buyer agent, is also a big responsibility for the listing agent to make sure that those monies are in place. But it is a very high responsibility also for the buyer agent, because if there are multiple offers and if the property is that interest, to have that contract secure with the deposit monies in the times that are stipulated in the contract, it is very important, because if you don't do that, you're giving that seller the chance to reject your offer even after it's signed, because you uh, um, you missed something in the contract, and now it can actually cancel that contract. You missed the dates or the deposit monies, it can cancel the contract. And sometimes there's other offers higher that came in while you are in attorney review, and a seller could take the chance to say, okay, I have a better offer in here. This person has not put yet the deposit monies. Let's cancel it. And so let's for now to follow up with the buyer agent situation. Imagine that everything is moving well and we have attorney review finished. We have a firm contract. Now we have to put immediately the second deposit so we can move on to go and do home inspections. We go to do the home inspections, and the buyer agent should be present and follow up on everything to be well informed of whatever situation it may arise during the home inspections. So then the results of those home inspections go to the attorneys, and depending on what was agreed in the contract, if it is totally as is, it is as is, and we move on to get the mortgage. Or if there is any situation that must be negotiated because of a problem that came up in the home inspections and it's going to be negotiated, that's where the presence of the buyer agent in the home inspections, it is very important. So he heard the same thing from the home inspector. He saw it. Now he can communicate very well also with the buyer's attorney, because the buyer's attorney was not there. And the buyer agent is the one that was there, and he should keep emotions aside he must be very conscious of the fiduciary duty with the buyer and what's best for that buyer. And he's the one with a practical point of view because he has done these things before, explaining clearly the pros and cons about what is going on with that situation. So once that is all clear and agreed, you will move on, and now it's time to have the commitment letter from the mortgage. So meanwhile, while you were negotiating these things, while the time was you were talking with your mortgage person, giving them the paperwork, and of course, the buyer agent should keep everybody informed and well aware of the dates for the commitment letter. Again, it's very important to be committed with those dates because if you're not, the seller can cancel the contract just for the reason that another offer came in. It happens. Um, some Somehow the seller is getting a little nervous, and if you give them the reason, they can cancel. If you follow the dates through properly, they cannot cancel. It's not that easy. So, mortgage approved, everything is fine, the appraisal came through, and now we're moving towards closing. And always, but always, the day of the closing or the evening before the closing, if the closing is first thing in the morning, the next day, do final walkthrough. Personally, I don't like to do final walkthroughs the day before, and if I must, because the inconvenience for the buyer to travel for the closing, the day of the closing, and it is, let's say, a closing at 9:30 a.m. is coming from the city, and it's not convenient to come any earlier because of transportation situations. We did the final walkthrough the day before, the evening before. I personally, no, I'm not going to the closing without stopping by the house and making sure that everything is the same way that was the evening before. Other agents do what they feel. I am that way because things happen, and I have a long history in the business, 32 years in the business. I've seen all kinds of things that I'm not going to start to tell stories now, but that's what makes me be like that. Final walkthrough is done, and we're going to the closing. And the buyer agent, it should be there also. I recommend always that in the final walkthrough, both the listing agent and the buyer agent are there. The listing agent has a big responsibility being at the final walkthrough, even though these days most listing agents don't show up for the final walkthrough. And when surprises arise, then the listing agent is not fully informed for that. So I'm going to leave it right now. Um, and for the next, I will follow up talking about the seller agent situation, and then we'll move on to the other agency situations. But I feel that if you have any questions, you can either call me or email me. I will be very happy to answer those questions. Maybe I can even answer those questions in the next video. I will take whenever I have questions to answer. I will keep a couple minutes to answer